In this video, we'll be writing controller classes. These method or classes are the destination points for web requests. This is where we write the actual REST API endpoints. For example, when we do a Google search, let's say I'm searching for Spring Boot. And so if I go to the network console, when I hit this, enter this request, it's going to send an HTTP GET request. So you can see it here. These are all the requests it's making. And if I scroll to the top, you can see this is making an HTTP GET request. So this is searching for Spring Boot. And this is an example of the REST API. So we're going to be writing something very similar where we're going to be writing REST API endpoints for our employee and payroll. And this flow and all of these requests are routed through a controller. So the flow is HTTP request comes in and it goes to the controller. And from there, it goes to our service layer, which is pretty much that contains our business logic. And it does all the operations on the domain or the model objects that we created. So we created the payroll and the employee objects. And then from there, it goes to our persistent layer, which is a repository interfaces that we created that in turn interacts with our database. All right, so let's create a new package and let's call this a controller. And we're going to create two controllers. We're going to create one for employee and the other for payroll. So let's do that. And we're going to mock this with or annotate this at REST controller. So this will make our life a lot easier. We don't have to return response. So we don't have to return a response body. It will automatically handle that for us. And we can just return a plain old object. I'm going to show you an example shortly. So the first thing that we're going to do is we need to first auto-wire our business logic for the employee service. And now let's write the first new REST API endpoint, which will be the post request, so where we need to add a new employee. So for that, we use this add post mapping. And from there, we need to pass in the path. So to do a post, we'll just say, /employee. And we are returning an employee object. And let's call this method new employee. We can call it whatever we want. And we're taking in a request body. So basically what this request body means is we're taking in a body request that is going to be in a JSON format. And that is going to be mapped to an employee model object that we created. And let's create a new employee. And let's call our service that adds the employee object to our database. And we are returning this employee object back to the controller or back to the client. So this at REST controller basically allows us to return this plain old object. Otherwise, if we didn't do this, we would have to annotate it with at request body and then return it that way. Sorry, not request body, response body. But since we added this at REST controller, we don't need to do this. Okay, so let's test out our new endpoint that we created. So this is where we're posting a new employee. So we're saving this to the database as well. And we're running this on port 8080. So we're going to be using Postman to post an employee object. So I've already created this template. So the first thing is we're using this post HTTP method. So post is recommended or is a recommended HTTP method used for when you need to create a new resource. So in this case, we're creating a new employee. So we use the post method. Then we need to pass in the URL. So we're running on a local host. We're running on port 8080. And this is our REST API endpoint employee. And we're passing in the body. So in the body, we're passing in a JSON format where we're supplying the model for the employee object that we created, which was first name, last name, and salary. So let's send this request. And you can see we got a response back with the status 200, meaning we got a good response back from the server. And we got the response back from the database as well. And we can verify this. So we're running it on, we're using H2 database. So if I log into H2 database, let me connect to it. And I can do select all from employee. You can see we posted our first employee. So let's actually clean up this method a little bit. So we were returning a response status of 200. So I want to return a response status of saying created. So a new resource was actually created. So for that, I'm going to change this to a response entity. And it's going to return an employee object. And we are returning a new response entity with a response status as well. So we're returning an employee and the HTTP resource created code. All right, so let's test this out one more time. So last time we got a 200 status. So if I run this, I got a created resource. So this means that the request was actually created. All right, so let's create our new endpoint, another endpoint, where we want to get an employee by ID. So for this one, we're going to use a get mapping. So we're going to be using a get request here. And the path for this is going to be an employee. And it's going to take in an ID. So here we're passing in the path variable. Again, we're returning a new response entity of type employee. And let's call this get employee by ID. So here we're taking in a variable from the path, which is an ID. So we need to define that. So with that, we use add path variable. And this name needs to match whatever we mentioned here. So let's call our employee service to get employee by ID. And let me just copy this part. And instead of created, we're going to say OK. All right, so this is done. We're going to do one. Let's do another one. So we're going to use get mapping again. And with this one, we're going to say the path is employees. And we are using the same thing, returning a response entity. So here we want to return a list of employees. So get all the employees from the database. So we're returning a list of employee. All right, now we want to create another HTTP method with the delete. So we want to be able to delete an employee by ID. So for this one, we're going to use the delete mapping. And we're deleting by ID. So this is going to be very similar to the one that we did for get employee. And this one, we're just going to return the HTTP status, meaning that, okay, basically the object was deleted. And we're returning a response entity with no content. And let's do the last one where we're updating the employee information. So for this one, we're going to use a put mapping. So for this one, we're going to use a put mapping. So put is used for doing any sorts of updates. We're going to return the updated employee information. So we're updating an employee by ID, and we are passing in the updated information for the employee. So we are also passing in another thing. So we need to pass in the information actually. So we need to get the response. Oopsie, it's not response body, it's actually request body. All right, so we got a couple of our endpoints ready. So again, we're going to go over. So post is used for doing any sorts of creation of the resources. Get is obviously doing any sorts of get, so getting any sort of data back from the endpoints. Delete is obviously used for doing any sorts of delete. So we want to delete an employee here, so we're going to use a delete mapping. And puts are used for any sorts of updates. Okay, so let's test out these endpoints that we created. All right, service is up and running. So let's post our first employee. And let's post our second employee. And now let's try to get all the employees. All right, so you can see we got the list of 2 employees, Jane and John. And let's try to get an employee by ID this time. So you can see here, we're passing in the path variable. So if you're passing in the ID, so ID 1. So let's try to get the first employee, Jane, and let's try to do the second employee as well, John. All right, let's try to update employee number 2. So for John, we're going to update the salary to 200. So here we're passing in the body. In the body, we're passing in the details of which employee we want to update and what field we want to update. In this case, it's a salary, and we're passing in a JSON. And you can see the request type is of HTTP method put. All right, so for John, the ID was the salary was updated, and we can verify again. We can get the employee by ID. So before we had 55.78, and now it got updated to 200. And let's try to delete the first employee. So you can see we are using the delete method here. All right, so our employee was deleted. We can see we got the status as 204, and we can verify it again. So if you do get all employees, we should only get one employee back, which is John. All right, So our REST API endpoints are working for employee. And now let's create the payroll endpoints, where we're going to actually create the payroll list for each employees. So we're going to create a new payroll controller. And let's label this with REST controller. And let's try to wire up the employee service. The payroll service. And let's create our first endpoint for payroll, where we need to post a payroll for a new for an employee. So again, we're going to use a post mapping for this. We are returning a response entity where we're returning the payroll. And let's pass in. So now we need to create the path for it. So the path will be payroll. And we are passing in the employee ID. So for which employee we want to create a new payroll for. So we're going to first take in a request body of payroll and the path. And let's call up our service to add this new payroll. All right, let's try to create the other mappings as well. So we want to now get the payroll by employee ID. So get a specific payroll for a specific employee by ID. So we're going to use get mapping, and we are passing in an employee ID as well. And here we are going to return the list of payrolls, because an employee can have multiple payrolls. So we're going to be returning a list. Now we want to get all the payrolls. So let's create an endpoint for that. So this will return all the payrolls for all the employees. And let's do one more, where we want to get a payroll by employee ID and also by pay period. So basically get a specific payroll for a specific employee. And this will take in two path variables. So the first one, we need to create the path. It's going to take in an ID, an employee ID, and it's going to take in the pay period. Okay, so let's test out our payroll endpoints. All right, we're gonna post the first employee. And let's just try to get all the employees just to make sure it got saved in the database. Yep, it did. All right, so let's try to post a payroll for employee number 2. So I already created these endpoints. So we're gonna post it for April 30th for pay period. All right, so look like I got an error. Yep. So let's take a look. All right, so I'm getting serialization error. Okay, let's take a look at our objects. Oh, that's right. Because we need to we don't need to serialize this employee object. Because this is where we're doing a mapping, so we're just gonna ignore this from being serialized. So we're gonna add JSON ignore. And hopefully this should fix it. Okay, so let's try testing this out one more time. So we're going to post employees again. So we're using H2 database. So with H2, every time we stop the application and run it, it pretty much clears out the database. So we need to post employee information again. All right, so we got all the employees. So now let's try to post a payroll for employee number 2. All right, this worked. So you can actually see the gross pay got calculated and the net pay as well, where we added that small formula. And let's try to, add one more payroll. Let's do it for May 15th. And let's try to get all the payrolls. All right, so we got 2 payrolls. Now let's try to get a payroll by employee ID. So we posted the payroll for employee number 2. So let's try to do that. All right, so this is the payroll we got for employee 2. And now we're trying to get the payroll by employee ID and pay period. So here I'm passing in the employee ID, and here I'm passing in the pay period. So the %20 is pretty much for the space. We need to add in Postman, it automatically handles it, so we don't need to do that. So I can just do it at April 30th. All right, so I got the payroll for April 30th, and let's try to do it for May 15th as well. Let's see if that works. Okay, that worked. Let's try to do May 16th, where the payroll does not exist. All right, so we got no results for that. And let's try to get a payroll for an employee ID, where we did not create a payroll. It should return an empty list. Okay, so our REST endpoints are working. Okay, so let's test out these endpoints and using MySQL Database. We're going to use that as our perm storage before we're using H2. So every time we stop the application, it would pretty much get rid of all the data. So we're going to be using MySQL Database. So to do that, let's use the main properties file. So our local property file is using the H2 database, and our main one is using the MySQL. So let's run the application. Okay, so I'm going to quickly post employee information. All right, so let's see if the data is in our table in MySQL. So we're going to execute this query. All right, so we got 2 employees, and we should see 3 payrolls. All right, so we see 2 payrolls for Jane Doe, which is employee number 2, and then 1 employee for John Doe. I believe 1 was John. Nope, sorry, the opposite. 1 was Jane Doe. And if I refresh the table, we should see the tables here as well. Now, if I exit out of this, so if I stop the application, I'm still going to have this data here. So if I refresh this, the data is still here. So it persists the data in this perm storage. Okay, so we just created our first REST API endpoint where users can create employee and their payrolls as well. So as shown earlier, this is the basic structure that you need to follow in Spring Boot. And from here, once you know the basic structure, we can create even bigger REST API endpoints for bigger projects. It's like once you know the cooking recipe, you can create a dish for hundreds of people. In the next video, we are going to create custom exception handling. So for, let's say, if employee is missing or for any custom error message handling, we need to create custom exception classes for that. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. And finally, let's push our code base to Git.